Okay, everyone, so we're going to go ahead and get started. It's so great to see all of you. My name is Ms. Powers. I run community engagement here at Carondelet, and I'm also the moderator of Carondelet Ventures. And I'm so excited to welcome Leta McCollough Seletzky to Carondelet and to the Gene Hoffman Center for Innovation today. So for those of you who don't know, Leta is a former lawyer and now an accomplished published author, and she's also a National Endowment for the Arts Creative Writing Fellow. Her essays and articles have appeared in various national publications, including The Atlantic, The New York Times, The Griot, and even the Oprah magazine, just to name a few. Leta has a BA from Northwestern University and a JD from the George Washington University Law School. She was born and raised in Memphis, Tennessee, which will be a pivotal location mentioned in today's lecture, and she now lives in Walnut Creek. Today's lecture will focus on her compelling book titled The Kneeling Man, which captures the story of her journey of discovery to uncover the hidden details of her father, Merrill McCullough's career in law enforcement and as a spy, which ultimately intersects with an iconic yet tragically captured moment in our nation's history and also overlaps with race and identity. She will explain more shortly, but to give you an idea, her father is the man seen kneeling beside Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. at the moment he was assassinated in 1968, in the famous black and white photo that is etched in books around the world that we've all seen. I know that there will be some crossover between what she speaks about today and what you're currently learning in your classes, so you're encouraged to absorb this information with curiosity so you can use it later on. Lastly, we will have a short Q&A with students later, and as well as the broader audience, and we hope that you will ask questions for her when the time comes. I'm gonna pass it to you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Powers. And I want to thank everyone in the Carondelet community and all of you for being here today and for inviting me to speak with you. So I understand that you all are juniors and that as part of your curriculum, you're learning about the civil rights movement. And you will also know that the civil rights movement, as one of its central aims, was seeking to rectify the wrongs that happened in the backlash against Reconstruction. You know, the Reconstruction era where formerly enslaved people were starting to get the basic rights of citizenship, the right to vote, the right to hold office. But then those rights were taken away. And so the civil rights movement is seeking to once again reclaim those rights for all Americans, you know, particularly those who have been targeted, you know, with these unfair policies and rules and laws. And, you know, it's really interesting to think about how going into the 1960s in the United States, many black people actually had fewer rights than they would have had or might have had at the end of the 1800s. And so, you know, that's really, it gives me chills to think about that because, you know, when people think about the 1960s, you know, what's the popular image of the 60s? I mean, I think about, for example, the Beatles or Elvis Presley. What else? Can somebody just name something, you know, when you think of the 1960s, what do you think about? Anybody? Who's brave? Yell out an answer. Yes. Old people? Yeah, a lot of them still hanging around too, right? What else? One more. Anybody? He said old people, so you can say anything. You know, drive-in movies. Oh, go ahead, yes. Okay, so, you know, people have this sort of, you know, this image of the 60s as this nostalgic sort of, you know, frivolous time, but obviously, there was a lot more going on. You know, there was a very ugly side to the 1960s that doesn't often get talked about, or even maybe gets hushed up, gets covered up. People don't want folks reading books about it, or, you know, they don't want people talking about some of the uglier things that happened in the 1960s. And I understand why that is, because people don't like to talk about stuff that makes them uncomfortable. They don't like to talk about racism or somebody being treated less than. People don't want to talk about, you know, what their role in that might have been, whether they were on the receiving end or maybe on the giving end of that. And people often don't want to talk about topics that are just suffused with trauma. However, you know, we had the answer about the old people from the 1960s. Well, a lot of them are still walking around. And so a lot of this stuff is in people's lived experience who are still here. Which brings me to this photograph, which is accompanying an article that I wrote about how some of the same dynamics that were happening in the 1960s are still happening today. And so this picture right here, this is the first photograph that I can remember that I saw of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And it really just kind of hit me the other day, like, that's the first image that I saw of Dr. King. Because, you know, when we see Dr. King a lot of times, you know, particularly around the holiday, you know, we have the, you know, the beautiful portraits, and I Have a Dream, and everything just looks, you know, kind of rosy. But this is what I saw first. And so in this scene, Dr. King has just been fatally shot. He is lying on his back on the balcony of Memphis's Lorraine Motel on April 4th, 1968. And there are several people who are standing around. You can see that they are pointing in the same direction. They're pointing in the direction where the shot came from that hit Dr. King. And so, you know, people, you know, notice the pointing fingers. They notice, obviously, Dr. King. But there's somebody else in this photo that people usually don't notice, which is why I provided you with this gigantic red arrow. There's a man. You can make out his silhouette. He is kneeling next to Dr. King. He's got his right hand on a towel. You can see the white towel that's covering up Dr. King's wounded jaw where the bullet entered. And he's got his left hand on the railing of that balcony. And even though most people don't notice this guy, my eyes have always gone to him, you know, after Dr. King, because that man is my father. And, you know, as we know, Dr. King was a man of peace. You know, he stood for nonviolence. He stood for equality. And yet, this is how his life ended. And, you know, I was shown this photo at an early age by my mom. My parents had split. And so, you know, I was probably about 5 years old. I had a 3-year-old little brother. And I remember my mom showing me this picture. I think it was in the local newspaper. And just simply pointing out, you know, this is your father. He was a police officer. And that's all anybody ever said about it. And no one ever spoke of it. But nobody really ever talked about my dad either, because they had a pretty nasty split. You know, they weren't getting along. So this was just all kind of unspoken. So all I knew was that he was a police officer. But what I learned later, as a junior in high school, actually, going through the local newspaper once again, was that he wasn't just any regular police officer. Look, nobody on this balcony, these people here, Dr. King's aides and cohorts, they didn't know he was a police officer because he was undercover. He was working undercover as a mole, you know, as an undercover officer who had infiltrated a black activist group called the Invaders. The Invaders kind of took inspiration from, you know, groups like the Black Panthers, more militant groups. And so they knew this man here as this guy. So not Mac McCullough, you know, Officer McCullough, the patrolman, but as Morrell, the 23-year-old Minister of Transportation for the Invaders. Now, you know, when I learned this from the newspaper, so many emotions, you know, because, of course, nobody ever really talked about the assassination in my family. Nobody, you know, just really said anything much about, you know, what his role was. And so when I found out from the paper, I mean, can you imagine what that's like, learning from the paper that your dad was doing this? And, you know, by my junior year of high school, I also am developing this kind of social awareness and social consciousness. And I had been reading about the Black Panthers, you know, Huey Newton and, you know, Black Power and all this stuff. And I rather sympathized with the Black Panthers. And so I was so confused. I was actually really embarrassed. I was thinking, I hope nobody at school has read this and I have to answer for, you know, the spying that my dad was doing that's in the paper. And I just thought to myself, how can a Black man infiltrate this group that is seemingly fighting for Black people's, you know, rights and liberation, and then turn around and report back to the Memphis Police Department? I couldn't get my head around that. And then, you know, I had just kind of these other questions, just, you know, more generally, how did my father, this man who, you know, I knew he was born in Mississippi in the 1940s during Jim Crow segregation, you know, how did this guy wind up being this undercover police officer for the Memphis police, and then after that, go on to his current job at the time, which was an officer for the Central Intelligence Agency. See, I already knew that by then. I already knew that as a junior. That's me and Dad when I was age 11. So yeah, he was a CIA officer at that time, and that's around the age that I found out. And you know, then when I found out a few years later that he had been spying on this Black militant group, that actually seemed a lot weirder to me than the fact that he was working for the CIA. Like the CIA thing, like I'd gotten used to that idea. You know, that didn't seem that strange to me anymore. But again, you know, that's another area of silence in our family. So you're sensing the theme, right? It's these silences, things that people aren't talking about for various reasons. It took me many decades later before I would actually be able to have the courage to break those silences and find out what happened. You know, what was it exactly that brought my dad to the balcony of Memphis's Lorraine Motel? You know, why was he there? What was he doing? And then how did he go from there to the CIA? And what I learned would actually transform my understanding not only of him, but of history. You know, it was like a guided personal tour through history. It would transform my understanding of society and even myself, you know, in the path that I found myself on in life. But the first step to getting these answers and breaking these silences was having a very awkward conversation with my dad, who, you know, by this point, I'm, you know, in my 30s, I'm living in Texas, I have 2 kids, I'm a lawyer working at a law firm. And so, you know, we talk, you know, we're not estranged or anything, you know, we talk, but it's very superficial, it's very cordial. And so I called him up just out of the blue one day. This was in 2010. Like, hey, Dad, you know, how you doing? Yeah, fine. Weather, yes, hot. Yeah, so we never talked about Dr. King's assassination. And he's just like, silence. You know, what? But I can kind of hear him laugh a little bit. And, you know, so, I mean, it almost sounds to me like he's relieved. Like, finally, somebody's asking me about this. And so he says, you know, I tell you what, I will send you some notes, and then I want you to read those notes, and then come back to me, and we'll have a conversation. So I said, great. So then shortly after that, I get this Word document, 17 pages, Courier font, and, you know, at the beginning, there's this bold kind of boilerplate, like preamble, you know, will be forthcoming, but will not violate my oath to my country or my duty to my friends, something like that. And I'm just like, why is this here? You know, this looks scary. Why does he need to put this here? Oh yeah, this is my dad and my stepmom, by the way, at the family business. So that's them. So anyway, I start reading the notes, and I can't even get past page 3. Cannot get past page 3. Because the story that he's telling me is so much. You know, and he starts off, actually, let's start here. Let's start here. This is my dad again. And this was my image of my dad. But what I'm reading in these notes, you know, he starts off, I was born in 1944 in Tibbs, Mississippi, and I had 11 siblings. I'm the 4th youngest of 12 children, and he's describing the poverty and the racism. And the image that I'm getting is just so different from what I knew Dad to be. And it was really painful to read, just that he had lived the things that he's telling me in these notes, and the stuff that he has even told me by page 3, you know, where he's still describing his childhood. Like, I put those notes down. I was like, I'll come back to this when I'm ready. And so that was 5 years later when I was able to actually pick up that document again and start reading, like start over from the beginning and really say, okay, I cannot quit this time. I've got to read through and really see, you know, what Dad has to tell me. Like, he had the courage to write his story down. I need to at least give him the respect of reading it and be strong enough to do that. And so I read the notes. This is now 2015. I come back to the notes. And after I read them, we set up an interview, an in-person interview down in Atlanta at my brother's house. And it was a very formal interview, and I recorded it, I transcribed it. And so this began a process of interviewing, you know, not only him, but various people who are involved in this story. I interviewed some of the invaders, a couple of the invaders, and did research and everything. And this is what began, you know, this personal guided tour of history. But I want to play for you just a snippet from this very first interview that I did with my dad, which I did like in a really formal way, like, you know, as if there were a court reporter or something in the room, and we're on the record. So let's see if this plays.
Okay, so it is Saturday, October 24th, 2015 at 12:31 Eastern Standard Time, or no, Eastern Daylight Time. And I have my dad here, and Dad, why don't you introduce yourself?
My name is Leta McCollough. I am Leta's father.
And so why don't we just do a few quick vital statistics at the beginning. So what is your date of birth?
My date of birth is May 13, 1944.
And where were you born?
I was born in Tunica County, Mississippi, in the Delta of Mississippi.
All right. Now, let's go back to kind of the beginning of those notes. So, these two people are my dad's paternal grandparents, Fanny and Willis Eugene. And so this picture was taken around 1910, and they were in Mississippi. And so having studied, you know, U.S. history, Reconstruction, Mississippi, 1910, black people, I mean, can you imagine what was going on? You know, what story does this photograph tell about this time? You can see that they are wearing very dirty, ragged clothes. They're standing in a field or, you know, some land that has been cleared. They're holding farming equipment, tools. They have very stern expressions on their faces. They look tired. So this is my dad's parents. However, there is more to them than what we see in this photograph. And as a matter of fact, Fannie and Willis Eugene actually end up becoming relatively prosperous, to the point where Willis Eugene becomes one of the first Mississippians to purchase an automobile, a Model T. And he buys that automobile for his son, Walter, who is my dad's dad, so my grandfather. So he buys, this Model T for Walter, and Walter shows up at the train depot to pick up this new car, and it's there, and it's wrapped in protective tar paper. So, yeah, they ended up doing okay. However, it's Mississippi, and it's, Jim Crow. So they are not ultimately able to pass along any generational wealth to Walter. No land, no money. They have nothing really to pass along to him. And in turn, Walter doesn't really have any generational wealth to pass on to my father. This is my father, Morrell Mac McCollough, as a young boy. He's probably about 6 years old at this point. And he was the fourth youngest of 12 McCollough children, born to Walter and Lucille McCollough. So here's Lucille, and here's Walter, Willis Eugene's son. And my father remembers the first few years of his life as pretty happy. He describes it as kind of like, there was this old TV show called The Waltons. Probably nobody here has heard of it. But, this very kind of idyllic, life on the prairie almost kind of existence. They had some rented land that they farmed, and they grew cotton and sorghum. They had a tractor. They had a mule. They had a wonderful community. And everything seemed pretty good until one day, Lucille collapses. She just falls ill and collapses in their cabin. And, they can't figure out what's wrong with her. Walter takes her to the closest, what they call the Negro hospital, the hospital for black people in Mound Bayou. And she begins a period of hospitalizations that drain the family's finances. And so once this happens, and they're basically giving any disposable income that they have to paying these hospital bills, they can no longer afford to rent this nice land and rent this nice house or have this equipment. So they have to leave the land, and they leave the house, and they become sharecroppers. Which, did you guys learn about sharecropping at all? Yes. Okay, so you know that this is exploitative and that this was a system that a lot of formerly enslaved people ended up falling prey to, where, they're working this long, exhausting season, and at the end of it, they have zero to show for it. They're being completely taken advantage of. And, this is something that arose in the aftermath of, the end of slavery. But, how chilling is it that, here is Lucille, Walter, my father, they're living in post-World War II, Mississippi, and they're part of that same system. And by the way, my dad is still alive. He is turning 80 next month. I'm going to go see him. And, this is part of his lived experience, sharecropping. So, they do this, they struggle. They used to be able to buy, enough food for themselves to last the whole winter. They would go and, buy this food because they had the money to do so. Some of it came in barrels. So, by the end of the winter, they were literally scraping the bottom of the barrel, but, they had enough food. They can no longer afford to do that. They're living hand to mouth. The family falls into disarray. My father and his next youngest brother, Floyd, are no longer going to school because, well, part of the reason is because there's nobody to make them go to school, because Walter is just working all the time trying to keep, body and soul together for everybody. But also, they don't have adequate clothes and shoes to go to school. They're wearing rags. And so, my dad, he's a young elementary school age kid, and his little brother Floyd are just running around the yard, nobody watching them, no shoes, wearing rags, just no direction, all day long. They lost a couple more siblings in their family. There was a 15-year-old who died after giving birth to a stillborn baby. There was a toddler who died probably from the pesticides that were on Walter's clothes when he would come in from the field, because she ended up having, a seizure and died, and my dad thinks that's what it was. So, things are really, really bad. But they turn around when Walter marries a woman they call Miss Ethel. And so Miss Ethel feels like it is her purpose in life to mother and raise children and to run a household, and that she does, very lovingly. And so she rights the ship. She makes sure that all the kids have adequate clothes, patched up, they have shoes, and everybody's on a schedule, and the kids are going to school. And so my dad gets to school, shows up in this 2-room schoolhouse with Floyd. And so he just walks up, to the principal, and he says, yeah, I'm supposed to be in 2nd grade, and my brother Floyd here is supposed to be in 1st. And so the principal just goes with it and just puts them in these grades. And so that's when he begins his, formal education. And he loves school, by the way. He excels. He loves to read. He loves to learn. He's reading ahead. At this school, they're learning Bible stories. And so he remembers having to learn the story of Samson. And he did such a good job that the principal had him come and recite the story in front of, older classes, older groups of kids. So he's really thriving. He's really in his element. And he knows he wants to continue with higher education. But only one problem. There's no way they could possibly afford higher education, except if he enlists in the U.S. military, then he can take advantage of the GI Bill. I don't know if you guys have learned about the GI Bill, but it's a way, right, if you serve this country, then you will get certain educational benefits. And so, he's got his kind of eye on that prize. But for now, he's in this school, and he's doing well, but the school isn't great because, again, now we're in the 1950s, we're in Mississippi, everything is completely segregated. And so the black schools don't have the books, they don't have the resources, they don't even have buses. And in fact, my dad and his brother, my dad can distinctly remember walking down this highway, going to school, and the school buses that are going to the white schools, rolling by, and the kids are like leaning out, jeering at them because they have school buses, but the black kids don't have school buses. But anyway, these are the conditions. Everything is segregated. Have you guys learned about segregation yet? It's totally, totally segregated. And I thought I was familiar with segregation, just growing up in the South, growing up in Memphis. And I've seen the signs and the water fountains. I've seen in my, family photo albums, my aunts and uncles as kids, and they're grinning and they're happy. And there's a little placard in the photo that says Colored Day at the Memphis Zoo, because on Thursdays, the black kids could go to the zoo. And so they're like, yay, this is in the family album. So I thought I knew about segregation. But to hear my dad just talk about this, it was just really striking. Of course the schools were totally segregated. The movie theaters, any kind of eating facility, stores, clothing stores. If you go into a clothing store as a black patron, you could not at least this is in Senatobia, Mississippi, which was kind of the closest big town to where he was, you could not use the fitting rooms, but the white patrons could. If you were standing in line and a white patron came to stand in line, they had the right to stand in front of you. That's how it was. Going to the doctor's offices were totally segregated. And my dad remembers that one time he was about 13 or so, and it was Easter, and he got really, really sick. And so Walter hauled him into town to go visit the doctor. And the main thing that my dad remembers from that, besides how sick he was this doctor zigzagging across the room to treat like patients on the white side, treat patients on the black side, and just going back and forth. That's how it was. Funeral parlors were segregated. So the white, patrons were in the front, the black patrons were in the back. This was the environment. And so my dad, he wanted to continue his education, and he wanted to kind of escape this environment and go on to do more than what this society would most likely allow him to do. And so he ends up enlisting in the Army. And here he is. He is a young military policeman. I'm going to put his age here around 19 or 20 maybe. So he enlists, and he takes this exam upon induction into the Army. And that exam ends up placing him into military police school. So, Uncle Sam is like, you're going to be a military police officer. Okay, yes, sir. So he goes to military police school, and then he serves his 3 years, both stateside and then overseas in Germany. So he enlisted in 1964. He comes back in 1967 after serving his 3 years. And he doesn't go back to Mississippi, of course, but he goes to the closest kind of like big city where he thinks, oh, I'm going to have job opportunities there, and that's Memphis. And he's also got some relatives there. So he goes to Memphis thinking, okay, now I can start my career. Only one problem. Nobody's going to hire him there either. Like, no one will hire him. He's pounding the pavement day after day, responding to ads, and no one will hire him. And so, he's getting really down about it, but he's got a cousin, Eugene, who has some positions of some responsibility at a couple of places. I mean, these are very low-wage jobs, like minimum wage type jobs. One of them is at a warehouse. The other one is at a motorboat repair company, like an engine repair. And so Eugene takes pity on my dad and hires him for these, minimum wage jobs. And so my dad starts working with Eugene. They work a full shift in the morning. They get up, it's still dark. They get up before the sun. They go work a full shift at the warehouse. Then they leave that job, work a full shift at the motorboat repair company. Then they go home, eat dinner, go to bed, get up, do it all again the next day. And so Mac thinks, okay, this is what my life looks like. This is my career. But that turns out not to be the case, because one morning, Mac and Eugene are on their way to the Sash and Door warehouse, and this ad comes on the radio. And it's a recruiting ad for the Memphis Police Department. And so when they hear this, Eugene turns and says, hey, Mac, weren't you a military police officer? You ought to go down there and apply for this. And my dad is just, he thinks there's no way that they're going to hire me. I mean, look, I already tried to get a job here, of much less responsibility. I wouldn't even be wearing a badge at those jobs, and they wouldn't even take a second look at me. So why would the Memphis Police Department, take me seriously? But he doesn't want to disappoint Eugene. So he says, okay, I'll just go pick up the application, he thinks, and fill it out, and I'll bring it back at some point. So he drops off Eugene at the warehouse, goes down to the Memphis Police Department headquarters. He's thinking he's just going to leave with this application. But it turns out this was the last day to apply. And so he's got to complete this application like right then and there and take the civil service exam that very day. And so thus begins a series of labors that ultimately lead to his joining the Memphis Police Department as one of their few black officers. And so he goes to the police academy, he graduates in December 1967, and he's just a regular patrol officer. He's doing foot patrols at a shopping center during the Christmas season. And he's doing car patrols through these various neighborhoods, which, by the way, when my dad first started out, so this is, late 67, early 68, black officers were only assigned to patrol black neighborhoods. They were never assigned to the white neighborhoods. So, things were still basically segregated in Memphis, even if, there wasn't necessarily a law on the books, but this is the way things were. This is the way things were done. And so, he's doing his job. He's trying to do his best. He has this idea of, upholding law and order, meaning that the same laws and rules apply to everybody the same, way every single time. And so, he's kind of idealistic. He's kind of naive about this point, but, he's doing the job. But then something unprecedented happens in Memphis in February 1968. This is a scene from Memphis's historic sanitation strike that broke out in February 1968, where the mostly black workforce of the sanitation department decided that they had had enough of this very poor discriminatory treatment that they received, the terrible working conditions. A couple of the workers had gotten crushed by their defective sanitation truck. Also, they're being underpaid, in some cases making less than minimum wage because of the way that the wages are calculated. And they also want to form a union, and they want union recognition and a dues checkoff on their paycheck. Well, once this happens, then law enforcement starts to get concerned, because anytime you have people who are protesting, they start to get nervous about unrest. And they're very nervous about these, what they thought of as, radical elements in society who were going to try to radicalize these strikers and cause some kind of, upheaval. And nationwide, there had been urban unrest. There was the long, hot summer of 1967 where, many cities in the United States had burned. Well, down in Memphis, they had this mindset of, we're not going to let this happen in our town. Our people are happy. They get along, and we're going to keep it that way. And so that is the way that they, proceeded. And so, immediately they want to know what's going on, with these strikers. Are they planning on doing anything radical? Are there any of these elements that are getting involved with the strike? And so, enter my dad, Officer Mac McCollough. He's a rookie police officer. He's 23 years old, close to the age of these young, some of the young folks in town, like the Invaders, who are activists. Most people in town don't really know him yet as a police officer because he hasn't been out that long. And he's black, which they barely have any black officers. So, he's one of the only ones that's going to be able to go into these strike supporters' meetings and really blend in and be able to listen in and report back what's being said, and what's being planned. And so he's asked to do this, and he's like, sure, which, I think about that, and, on one hand, I'm like, really? But then on the other hand, when I put myself in his shoes, 23, and, idealistic, and, having this feeling that, well, I'm just going to report the truth. And if they're planning to harm people, if they're planning to burn down, the entire downtown, then yes, the police department ought to know about that. And if they're not doing anything wrong, or if they're not dangerous, then I'll report the truth of that as well. He has no idea what he's getting sucked into, much less that this path is ultimately going to lead him to, the balcony of the Lorraine Motel at the scene of one of history's most tragic and pivotal events. So this is him. You know, he's wearing this windbreaker. You can barely make out the seal. It says Memphis State University. Because remember, I mean, his goal, he never had a dream of being a police officer. He just wanted to get an education. And because of that, now he's on that path, you know, from, the segregated schools to the military to the police department. Now he's an undercover mole, you know, spying on a black activist group. So this is him. I mean, he pretty much blends in. You know, he's the Minister of Transportation now for the invaders. And, he does that. And he reports back the truth of what he observed, which was that the invaders are not a threat. They're not dangerous. They're just a bunch of guys that get together and they talk about, radical politics. He ends up staying at the police department for several years. Here he is celebrating a birthday. And he goes to Vice and Narcotics, from the undercover job. And then from there, he goes to college part-time while he's working. And look, he gets what he always wanted from the time he was in that 2-room schoolhouse, which is his degree. He gets his higher education. And so that's where that path led. And then from there, seeing that he has reached a ceiling at the Memphis Police Department, because, by the way, I mean, this is a racist organization. He sees that he's not going to be able to rise to the rank that he deserves. He ends up going to the federal government, to the Central Intelligence Agency, where he served a long career from 1974 through 99, and then went back as a contractor. This is the medal that he got after he retired. This is him with 3 of his siblings who are standing, and that's a cousin in the front. He's the last one left of the siblings. Of the 12 McCollough children, he's the last one. And had he not told me his story, if I had not asked him, that story, would just stay with him alone, and would pass out of this world when he passes out of it. And I think that would be so tragic. But again, we're talking about breaking silences. And, as we said at the beginning, the silences are driven in part by people not wanting to talk about things that are painful, but also silence being imposed from the outside, because there are a lot of students that aren't allowed to study civil rights. And so I'm so glad that you guys are allowed to study this, and not only just the names and the dates, but what the meaning is, and not only what happened, but what it felt like. Thank you.
All right, so now we're going to have Faye Olatunji and Kate Manzone come up for a quick Q&A with Leta.
Hi, nice to meet you. I'm a junior as well.
Nice to meet
Faye. Okay, so your story includes both historical and very personal information. What was the impact of telling this story on your family, specifically your relationship with your dad after writing the book?
It allowed us to have a real relationship because, as I mentioned, growing up with all those silences kind of meant that we didn't really know each other all that well, because how can you know somebody well when you don't know about such a central thing that happened to their life, that happened in their life, that also happened to be a pivotal moment in American history and world history? And so uncovering this story and excavating it with him, and getting the truth out there has been so profoundly healing. It's allowed us to be close, as, father and daughter, and then, just family members. Now they know that they have, not only do they have nothing to fear about, who my father is, on the balcony of this, motel, what he was doing there. Not only do they have nothing to fear about that, but they actually have a lot to be proud of.
And what would you consider the most interesting lesson or piece of information that you learned during your journey to write this book that you might not have been expecting?
There was so much, so much. I would say it was really, I was really struck by how much, all the different players in the story really had kind of the same goals, even though they approached these goals in very different ways. The goal of kind of living out the fullness of their humanity and really having agency, personal agency over their lives. I mean, this is what Dr. King stood for and fought for. But this is also what some of the folks who were not supporters of nonviolence also were fighting for. The invaders, for example. And this is something that my father was likewise trying to do from his very peculiar position, as an insider in this system. And so it just really brought home for me the ways in which people are working inside of systems and outside of systems to try to get free and what that can look like.
Can you also tell us a little bit more about the difference between a police informant and an undercover police officer and how that impacted your dad's story?
That's a great question, and it's something that comes up a lot because, an undercover police officer is a commissioned police officer. In my father's case, it's someone who has been through the police academy, who, understands where the lines are very well. He knows he cannot suggest any course of action to the people who are around him. He's just there to observe and report. This is different from a police informant who is not a commissioned police officer, but just a person who is, typically getting something in return for the information they're giving, whether it's money. A lot of informants, were paid, in the 60s to give information, or, perhaps they have some kind of criminal charges hanging over their head. And so they're trying to, kind of make that go away, or at least mitigate the seriousness of that. So those would be kind of the main differences. And so it impacts my dad's story because he was moving through this story with this overarching idea of professionalism. And I don't think that a paid informant in particular, isn't necessarily gonna have that mindset.
And then at Carondelet and De La Salle, we're encouraged to impact social change for the causes we believe in as students. So do you have any advice to share that you have learned in your journey writing this book for us to impact change?
I do. And I think that it really comes down to really being intentional about who you are, who you choose to be in relationship to the institutions in your community and in your society. We are all, a part of various institutions, whether it's the school or, what have you. However, we all have a role in the status quo. And so I think just think about what your role is in the status quo, what kinds of changes you would like to see, because we know that things are not perfect. We know that things can be improved. So think about what those changes can be and how you can impact them from where you are, working with the institutions or even outside of the institutions, whether that means making change from the inside or coming from the outside and saying, hey, this needs to be changed. And also, I would say that change on this, change of this kind starts small. It's the mustard seed, right? Which starts out as a tiny grain. And so, if you really just change and improve the life of one person and that person passes it on to the next and the next, pretty much you change the world that way. It's catching. And so I would say think small, think mustard seed small, and do that.
Thank you. Lastly, can you describe the journey of your work on this book in one word?
That's a tough one. The word I will give you is transformative.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.